Thanks. So as Linda said, I'm new to California. I'm new to the California Department of Agriculture, so I'm really glad to be here. As you can see, I'm a technical specialist, and I've been with the CDFA for about 2 months now, spending a lot of time with our inspectors and with our administration, and then also with our partners over at California Department of Public Health. So I guess what I would really like to do today is share with you some of the things I've learned over the past 2 months, especially when it comes to agricultural water and inspections, because I know that is that's where the rubber hits the road, isn't it? So we're going to first figure out, there we go. We're going to talk a little bit about compliance dates just to remember and remind ourselves of where we stand. We'll talk about how CDFA inspectors are approaching it, and to give away the punchline, we're educating until the compliance dates. What are we educating on? Well, good agricultural practices and other guidelines, which Donna and Ronnie have already done a great job of going through. And I'll talk to you a little bit about what my CDFA inspectors have told me they actually look for and go into during the inspections, because I think that will be of interest to you. And then we'll end by just talking a little bit about the inspectors and the inspections and the inspectional process, to just to share that information and maybe undo any mystery that might be surrounding it, because it's not meant to be a mysterious process at all. So I think the most interesting thing about this talk today is that as the regulator, I'm really not going to talk about regulations very much, because there aren't any regulations right now when it comes to, well, there are very few regulations, I should say, when it comes to compliance with water quality requirements within the produce safety rule. Our current understanding of compliance dates, like Donna described earlier, is that the first compliance date that might happen is January 2022, that there are staggered compliance dates up through January 2024, depending on the farm's business size class, depending on how much average produce they sell in the past 3 years. And if you've been through the PSA grower training course or gone through the exemptions and exclusions flow chart that FDA put out, you know that a farm that sells less than $25,000 in 2011 dollars, which is about $28,500 in today's dollars per year, 3-year basis, annually adjusted for inflation, they're actually excluded from the produce safety rule. On the other hand, so that's why we're not going to talk about specific regulatory requirements in subpart E of the produce safety rule, because the compliance dates aren't there yet. But it has always been since 1938, as Donna pointed out, part of FD&C, a farm may not, Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, a farm may not sell adulterated produce into commerce. And I wrote down some of the key words for adulterated, because if you're like me, the word adulterated has a general meaning, but some of the words within that definition of adulterated, just so you know what we're talking about or where we're coming from when we look for something that might be adulterated, some of the key words, I won't read the whole definition, are poisonous, deleterious, injurious to health, putrid, filthy, decomposed, some of my favorite words, and unfit for food. So adulterated means gross stuff, things that might make people ill. So that is really our goal. And I want to talk a little bit about and bridge that gap between a regulatory organization focusing on education. And I want to portray to you our perspective that we're all in this together. We really, I mean, the end goal of all the rules and regulations, and you can see that from the definition of adulterated, the end result that we're all working toward is that the things that we grow and sell do not make other people sick. And it's not that anyone, and one of the things that our CDFA inspectors can do is help through our educational and our inspectional process, is help a grower understand when, unbeknownst to them, they might actually be running a risk of making people sick. We educate about some of those risk factors, and then we try to help minimize the risks. And at the end of the day, at the end of the year, at the end of the decade, we want to show benefits of this regulatory system, where we see fewer illnesses, fewer farms that are under investigation, fewer farms that are vulnerable to issues that would happen if the farm was implicated in a foodborne outbreak. So we're really working together to try to avoid any of those unpleasant outcomes for the business or for the consumer. So produce safety rule, although it's not it is under reevaluation by FDA. Until it's published in final form, the produce safety rule requirements can't be inspected against. But that doesn't mean our inspectors aren't going to be asking some questions and looking at your water. And those two reasons for that are FD&C Act of 1938, that no adulterated food may be sold. And then the other one that Donna mentioned earlier, 112.11, that says in part that a covered farm must take appropriate measures to minimize the risk of, I'll paraphrase, illness or death from known and reasonably foreseeable hazards. And water that has poop in it is a known or reasonably foreseeable hazard. And Ronnie pointed that out very nicely with that image of a sewage line that was dripping from under a bridge. That once it was identified, that became a known hazard. So when our inspectors go out on the farm, they won't always, but they might ask to understand how your water is used and discuss some of the potential hazards to try to avoid issues. They might look at the water system and describe any of the risk factors. Ronnie went through a lot of the risk factors about a water distribution system. They might look for results of water quality tests and talk about what those results mean. Donna talked a little bit about water quality tests in particular, and then some other aspects. Like any time, it's not just educational, it is an inspectional visit. And if the inspector sees an egregious condition, then something might need to be done during that inspectional visit. I want to preface this next slide by saying thus far in California inspections, there have not been any egregious conditions identified due to farms' water use. But I do think it's important for us to go ahead and talk about what an egregious condition is, why we use that, and what does it really mean? Because egregious is another word kind of like adulterated. What does that really mean? So to help to give you a little bit of a foundation, I just want to share with you that the California Department of Food and Agriculture is inspecting on behalf of FDA. So when when Congress passed the produce safety rule and said FDA should enforce it, FDA gave states the choice of enforcing it themselves or letting the FDA come on into the state to enforce it. California opted to have food and agriculture inspectors enforce on behalf of FDA. But since we're enforcing on behalf of under FDA credentials, we are following FDA's rules, guidances, and policies. One of those policies that FDA and the NASDA, the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture, hashed out was a working definition of what is egregious. And that definition is going to sound a lot like adulterated. Basically, it's a situation on a farm where a serious adverse health consequence, which earlier I abbreviated that as illness or death, could occur from consumption or exposure to covered produce, or that there's an imminent public health hazard if a corrective action is not taken immediately. So although it's unlikely that those conditions would be observed during an inspection, if they are, I hope you would agree that something needs to be done. What gets done is going to be determined case by case between the regulator and the farm. The inspector themselves do not make the call on the farm unilaterally. The inspector would describe the situation up through the command chains, discussing it with specialists such as myself, administrators, and others to ensure that actually does fit the definition of an egregious condition. But if there is a serious health consequence due to exposure or an imminent health hazard, if something isn't done, well, then there would be a corrective action required at the time. The specifics would be on a case-by-case basis. As I said, what we know about the outcome of that condition is that however it happens, adulterated food would not be allowed to reach the consumers. So I hope that explains egregious, explains the why for egregious, And I hope we can all be on board that if those conditions were observed, then something does actually have to be done to protect our consumers and to protect our businesses and to protect our California agriculture. So now we'll talk about how. Ronnie and Donna both went through different portions of produce safety. They use produce safety rule as the framework, talking about good agricultural practices and other guidelines having to do with what type of water, what quality of water, the distribution system, the treatments of the water. So I'm just going to take 4 slides and go through these one by one and just talk about these categories in general. You've heard the background and the whys of what causes these things to be, or what aspects of these elements are risk factors. I just want to talk about some of the specific things that the inspectors tell me that they look for when they go out onto a farm. And these things that the inspectors look for are actually linked directly to the risk factors that Ronnie and Donna described just a few minutes ago. So we talked about water type. You know that city water and groundwater, especially if it's protected groundwater, are typically low risk when it comes out of the spigot. The city water is treated. Groundwater, if it is properly protected, it's been underground for hundreds, if not of years, if not longer, it's not going to have fecal contamination in it. But what can happen? On many farms, especially for low yielding wells or for other circumstances, that water is stored in a larger volume tank. If it's a closed and protected tank, the inspector is not going to have many questions. But as you can see, if you that middle image is a do-it-yourself swimming pool style situation where clearly animals have access to that and it could be contaminated during storage. The image on the right is a beautiful storage tank. It's clean, it's well protected, it's sealed. But if you'll notice that the source of the water into that tank is coming from the roof. And the question is, how many birds crapped on that roof before it rained and the water got collected? So we really don't know the source of the water. So in the left image, if the water were being stored in that closed, pretty tank, the inspector may not have any questions. They may, they've looked at it, they satisfied their they gain some knowledge about how you are storing your water. They may not have any questions, but they would definitely have questions about those other 2 circumstances. Water quality. Although you are not required at this time to keep water quality results in your record, that's part of the produce safety rule as it was originally written. But as you know, compliant states are not here for those requirements. The inspector might ask to look at them. You don't have to show your water quality test results, but if you choose to show your water quality test results, you might have a meaningful conversation with the inspector about whether the water quality meets your needs. For decades, I've been teaching good agricultural practices for well over 10 years. And it is one of the things that I never like to do is say, test your water, know what the E. coli concentrations are, and then leave it hanging about, well, what's good enough? What can we do? The challenge is that it is difficult to establish a firm cutoff between what's acceptable and what's not acceptable for general uses. But I would like to give you a couple of benchmarks that might be meaningful and help put the numbers that you see in your water into perspective. So we'll start with drinking water. How much, I'll say it anyway, I've already said it. How much crap is okay to have in your drinking water? The answer is none. Where there is E. coli, there is probably some fecal contamination. And I think we can all agree that no fecal contamination is a really good target for drinking water quality. Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement define type A and type B water. In part because of the romaine lettuce outbreaks of the past few years. So within 21 days of harvest, LGMA has established a guidance that type A water, which in part, this isn't the entire definition of type A water, but type A water is also going to be no detectable E. coli in at least 4 out of the 5 tests. And then that 5th test can have a very small amount, up to 10 CFU of E. coli per 100 milliliters. Basically, the microbial equivalent of drinking water, because we've had it demonstrated to us that leafy greens such as romaine are vulnerable and it is worth some effort to use highest quality water on those crops, especially when it's close to harvest. When it's further from harvest, up to 21 days, LGMA allows type B water. GM is geometric mean of less than 126, and then all samples must be less than 576 MPN or CFU of E. coli in 100 milliliters of water. If many of you won't remember from your PSA grower training courses or your high school statistics course, or you may have never learned what a geometric mean is, but as a rule of thumb, a sample set, if you have 5 samples, 10 samples, 20 samples, if more than half of those samples is less than 126 E. coli, then in general, if you calculate the geometric mean on that data set of 5 samples, 10 samples, 20 samples, when more than half the samples in the data set are less than 126, the geometric mean is usually going to be also less than 126. And then LGMA is saying 576 is their upper limit. If that water ever has a sample higher than 576 within the time frame of LGMA's sampling strategies, then that's not acceptable for use as type B water or in direct contact with produce up to 21 days of harvest. And not to belabor this point, but EPA has recreational water standards. I don't think this has ever been explicitly said, but let's just say that for some people, the statement, if it's clean enough to swim in, it's clean enough to water produce with, passes their gut check. So if for whatever reason, sometimes EPA recreational water standards are used as a benchmark. Again, we've got the geometric mean of 126. So as we talked about for LGMA, more than half the samples are less than 126. Statistical threshold value less than 410. This isn't the mathematical description of statistical threshold value, but a sample set will generally meet the statistical threshold value calculation if more than 90% of the samples, if 9 out of 10 samples are less than 410. 1 out of 10, 2 out of 20 could be higher than 410 and reasonably be expected to meet the statistical threshold value. So why did I spend 5 minutes of your life talking about that? Because ideally, there's not going to be any fecal contamination in the water that we use to put in contact with our produce while it's growing. The world is not ideal. As Ronnie said, sometimes we don't have control over the quality of the water that comes into our possession from upstream uses. So there are limits that are typically set as to how much is too much. Some of those limits that have been set in other contexts are 126, 410, 576. FDA may or may not decide to set limits under the produce safety rule. That's still pending. But until then, it seems reasonable that if your E. coli levels are less than something like 100, then you could say, well, by most guidances and criteria, that would be not unreasonable to use in contact with produce that's growing, other than perhaps leafy greens if you're going under LGMA. But if you have a sample that runs to 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000, please seek some advice from a specialist or an expert or someone you know to think about what is the actual risk of using that water in contact with the produce, because by most available guidances, that water quality that's in the thousands of E. coli per 100 milliliters would not be acceptable for use. So that's the kind of advice that I would expect the inspectors would give as we are on the farm. Sorry, I fell into educational extension mode for a second there. We'll talk about water distribution systems during an inspection. Some of those observable risk factors are going to be different for wells, piped systems, and open systems. And Ronnie went through some great images on that, especially for open systems like your canals and your reservoirs and your sometimes your swimming pools that have been adapted to serve as reservoirs. Animal access to the water source means the risk for fecal contamination. Pipes, aluminum pipes that are stored on the ground when not in use. As I've traveled around California, I've been very happy to see that most of the pipes that I've seen in storage have been off the ground where rodents are less likely to nest in them. But animal access to the pipes when they're not in use, that's a risk factor for having fecal contamination be deposited into those pipes. Backflow prevention. Is the backflow prevention not only present, but working? And then if you have a working backflow prevention device in your system, have you have you introduced, or are there other risks introduced? For instance, in some cases, the source of the water is here, the backflow prevention device is here, and there's a threaded spigot between the two. So now there's a vulnerability that's introduced into the water system between the source and that prevention device. So those are things that the inspector might be looking for, those visual factors in a water distribution system. Leaks under pressure. I said dead heads, dead legs. Leaks under pressure not only lead to pooling, but if it leaks when it's under pressure, if it leaks out under pressure, it might leak in when the pressures are reversed. And we could tell stories about that if we ever have a chance to sit down and have beverages. Dead legs are an opportunity for stagnant water. E. coli, salmonella, listeria, when they're in stagnant water with nutrients and nice warm conditions, they can grow under those conditions. And especially in a dead leg, they can just slowly siphon off from that dead stagnant water and enter into the main flow of the system. Was the well properly? I always want to say, was the well developed? Was the well properly developed? This goes back to Ronnie's question about, is it, how deep is the well? Is it appropriately, I've lost the term, the casing. Is the casing appropriate? Has it been packed appropriately? Was it developed properly? And then the things that are visible, the wellhead grade, is the land sloping away? Is the physical condition of a concrete pad, if present, is that physical condition, and making sure that the water, any pooling hasn't seeped underneath, leading to some vulnerabilities, cracks in that concrete well pad. And then of course, the basic sanitary seal at the top to make sure that things can't get in. There's Kristen Woods, who used to work with me at the Produce Safety Alliance, had a great image of a wellhead cap that was loose and a snake coming up out of that wellhead. When snakes, of course, can carry salmonella. Water treatment, we're going to touch on, even though it's the topic of next week's, but if you're not here for next week, it seems unfair not to at least mention that production and pre-harvest water, or production water, otherwise known as pre-harvest water, sometimes is treated. The Produce Safety Rule inspector would focus on treatments that are labeled to manage microorganisms of public health significance. It's an efficacy statement on the EPA label. What it means is pathogens or generic E. coli, because generic E. coli is an indicator of fecal contamination. Pathogens such as E. coli 0157, salmonella are commonly named on those efficacy statements. And the reason for focusing on the EPA label is that if you are treating your water that is then land applied on fruits and vegetables or other produce, that treatment is technically an antimicrobial pesticide, and it falls under EPA's labeling requirements. So that's the topic of next webinar, but I do want you just to mention that the inspector may be asking about the treatments that you put into your water if you are treating your production pre-harvest water, and they would be really focusing their questions on, is it appropriately labeled, and are you following those EPA label requirements, which is something that Ronnie had brought up earlier. So I'm going to end just briefly. I see that I've already hit a benchmark for time. Let's talk about the CDFA inspectors and the inspectional system, just so that you are not surprised, or so that you're not dreading an inspectional visit. In general, California is broken up into 5 regions. We have inspectors who are assigned to each region, but the inspectors do work across regions because we don't need to be pigeonholing, and we do try to cross-fertilize and everyone knows others' regions and share some of the joys of being in each region of the state. There will be an initial inspection on all covered farms eventually. That initial inspection is regulatory, but it is done with an educational approach. You can even sign up for an on-farm readiness review before your inspection, which is a non-regulatory visit that's a strictly educational approach. So OFRR is one opportunity to get prepared for an inspection, but when the initial inspection happens, it will be an inspector who's there with regulatory intent, but an educational approach, unless things are egregious or there are other major issues. It is a conversation, not a situation where things are cited. After the initial inspection, there will be routine inspections, meaning every several years, you could expect to see the inspector come back again and reevaluate your farm. And if there is a if there were issues found in your initial inspection that required follow-up, there might be follow-up inspections. So those routine and follow-up inspections are generally going to be more specific. They're going to be more rule-oriented. A few things about inspections to make sure that you're all aware is that the inspections are always announced. We do everything we can to reach out to you and to schedule that inspection so that you're not surprised. We know that your day is busy. We don't want to show up on a day when you're not doing anything. The inspector is going to show up ideally on a day when you're harvesting so that we can see how the harvest process works and talk about what has happened prior to harvest. Inspection time will vary. It can take hours because it does take a couple of hours for an inspector to understand your farm and go through all the aspects of produce safety rule. It might take up to about a half a day, depending on how complicated things are. Inspections are not optional. If the inspector calls, you are obligated to agree to an inspection. After the inspection, the farm will receive a report from CDFA describing the findings of the inspection. So more information about the inspections, and I think, Aaron, if you don't have this, we can copy and paste it into the chat box later. CDFA has a produce safety program site that's fairly easy to remember. And there's also a farmer questionnaire to help you understand what's your coverage status. We have recently updated our what to expect during an inspection website. I'm in the process of getting that posted now, so it should be up next week or the week after. But from the homepage, from the Produce Safety Programs homepage, you would select Regulate. There's a menu of some available information options, and you'll see basically what I've spelled out to you, but in more detail, including some frequently asked questions about inspections. So with that, I will shut my time, say thank you for allowing me to be here and share with you, and I'll look forward to Linda wrapping us up, and then some questions and answers.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Don. That was great. Good information, and we'll add your links to our growing list of links. Now I got to share my screen, and let's see if I can do this the way I know. Let's see, what are you seeing? Are you seeing my slide? Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. Okay, good. That was a little weird for a second, but anyway, yeah. So I just wanted to wrap this up before the questions, and I'm still encouraging people to put questions into that chat box. Just a few things on resources. As we said, we're gonna get back to you, but if you lose your email, you can't remember, we will have a section on our website that is devoted to this e-learning series, and under training right now, and that's where we're going to host a series of resources. If you go there now, we have the resources posted. So there's links to the videos at the top. And as you scroll down, there's information on signing up for these workshops on water. And if you scroll down a little bit further, then you hit this section on resources. And so this first resource here is that questionnaire that Ronnie was talking about in his presentation. There's some links to the United Fresh Produce Association information that Donna talked about. And there's some information from Washington State University. So we'll be building these out with additional resources that we talked about today that ended up in the chat box today. So you'll get it in an email, but you'll also be able to find it on the website. If you scroll down a little bit further, you will find 3 short videos that talk about, one of them talks about annual inspection. So that is one that, you know, aligns very well with what we talked about today. Sometimes it helps to hear the same information twice or more than one time in different ways. But there's also 2 additional videos on preparing to collect water samples and one on aseptic water sampling. So both of those pertain specifically to water sampling. As you heard today, water testing is still something that is useful for determining water quality. In addition, because we got asked this question in the registration questions, so one of those questions was about tools that somebody could use to process or evaluate summarize their water quality profile when it was talking about E. coli test results. And so we have resources for that under this tab at the UC Food Safety pre and post harvest. And under that tab, there will be a separate tab called agricultural water. And so there's a whole bunch of resources already there about agricultural water. And if you scroll down at that website, there are links to a calculator that we developed at the Western Center for Food Safety. That is an Excel spreadsheet and allows you to plug in your information and everything calculates automatically. But there's also a link to an app and an online calculator that was developed by University of Arizona. And so all of these are here free resources for you to take advantage. And let's see, Erin, I think you were going to host the questions in this next section.
Sure. I didn't see any live come in today in the chat, so we still have time. If you have questions, please type those in. So I pulled some questions that came in during the registration that I thought we could work through a little bit here with the time we have left. There were actually 2 that were related to how some unique water sources would be classified in the context of the produce safety rule, whether they be considered ground, surface water, municipal water. So I might kind of throw this one to Donna and Don to start with, and then others feel free to jump in. So the first question was, how is a spring classified? So a spring water, would that be a groundwater, surface water source? Thoughts?
Can I just jump in with the regulatory response?
Yes.
It depends. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you.
Take it away, Donna. And then
I
I'll give a serious answer later if there's anything lacking.
I was actually going to throw it to Don because I think this is his favorite subject to talk about. Or
It really is.
So I was going to say it depends as well, but I was going to give a little more context. So a spring, based on my working with springs more in the Northeast, it depends on if there's surface water intrusion into it. So it really depends on the layouts, a number of things. I often recommend it to growers that taking a water sample might help you answer that, because if there is E. coli in your spring water, then there's a good chance there's some kind of surface water intrusion or contamination. Whereas if you don't see any E. coli, or sometimes they would even do a total coliform test, depending on how they're using that water, you might be a little more confident that it is actually a filtered spring. But then I'll pass it back over to Don.
Yeah, I would just add that when we say it depends with tongue in cheek, the driving factor is when that water becomes exposed to the environment, it becomes surface water, according to the definitions that are not in subpart E, they're in subpart A, so they're not subject to change. But there's no need to quote it. Essentially, groundwater that is influenced by surface water and exposed to the environment is characterized as surface water. So at the time the spring hits the surface, if it's a spring pool, then it's going to be surface water. If you have a pipe that's driven in collecting from the subsurface before exposure, then you have a good chance that it would be classified as still groundwater. Is that fair to everybody else?
So the other question was related to recycled water. So we do have a system that recycles water that can be used for irrigation or for growers or people's home gardens, used in fountains, and it's treated to some extent, but it's not potable water. So how would that type of water, if being used on covered produce, kind of be considered under the produce safety rule?
I was
Do you
going to
want me
ask
to take it, or do you want it, Donna?
either, or I was going to ask Ronnie if he's, I'm
Yeah.
not sure.
Yeah, let Ronnie
Noted
talk.
in his presentation, so he might have some good insight here.
Well, it is, I mean, it's considered piped water coming out of treatment. So it is a utility and it is a municipal supply typically. So under the rule, it's considered a municipal supply. So at least in my opinion. Now, I don't know the CDFA if they treat it differently, because purple valve water is treated differently in the valley. Because it is purple valve versus other types of well water, things like that. So I would assume that you would need basically just what the PSA training is, get certificate from the utility and have that on hand just to start. Now, if you're impounding it or anything like that, then it becomes surface water or all these other things. But yeah, I think it's a municipal source.
Right. And we would not have had we would not have developed a specific policy on that yet because we don't have rules related to it. Before the compliance dates were extended, FDA did put out a little bit of guidance that said that for when it came to reclaimed water, this is in the preamble, and Donna, since you were the queen of the preamble, correct me if I'm wrong here, but they said if it meets the two criteria, the E. coli criteria and safe and of adequate sanitary quality, then it can be used as agricultural water. Then the question becomes, what do we mean by safe and of adequate sanitary quality? To me, the conservative way to use that water is, if possible, use it so that it is not in contact with the produce. That seems to be the safest, most conservative use. And if you can't do that, then it would be worth a discussion.
Aaron, do you see the questions in the chat?
I do. So we had a couple come in. I'll start at the top. So we have university-owned farms that have a farm store that generate revenue and sell their produce. Over the years, revenues have grown, and they're anticipating perhaps being over that sales threshold that would make them potentially subject to the produce safety rule. Should we expect a CDFA inspection anytime soon? That's the question.
So I would encourage you to fill out that questionnaire so that you're on our radar, so that we know, so that we can work with you to schedule an inspection if it's appropriate. I will tell you that right now, as we're ramping up our program, we have a lot of inspections to do and very few inspectors to do them. So I would not expect, unless for some reason you were priority listed to have an inspection or requested an inspection, I would guess that as we go through the process of scheduling inspections with with some prioritizations, that you wouldn't necessarily expect to get inspected soon. But it's just good to know what your status is. So I would encourage you to fill out that questionnaire.
Thank you.
Can I actually follow up on something that Don mentioned earlier? So Don, I just looked up your response in the preamble, you're spot on. But since I talked a little bit about other buyer requirements, such as gap audits, I did want to mention in the produce safety rule, we've talked about a lot of focus on testing the water source. If any of you are starting with water testing and such, even if it's like reclaimed water, I would still recommend that you test somewhere at the end of the line, even though it's not a requirement in the produce safety rule. Taking an end of line sample, and by that I mean at the end of a sprinkler, somewhere where it's gone through your distribution system, that might help you give a better understanding of what's going on with your distribution system. So just another recommendation that's often given. And in some buyer requirements, it's also a requirement to take a certain number of those end of line samples.
Great. The other question that came in the chat: for a farm that is fully covered, would record of a weekly water system inspection satisfy the annual requirements? Ronnie's giving it a big thumbs up.
So I'll just pipe in there. As Ronnie pointed out, it's a minimum of one time per year. So you can do more. What I would expect is probably a weekly inspection, might be a reduced focus inspection, or maybe you would do certain things once a month on a rotating basis. So you want to make sure that annually the full inspection occurs. But if that's actually what you're doing every week, a full inspection, then that more is always better. And what is at least annually means that technically, if you inspected this year on January 1st and next year on January 5th, that is less than once a year, right? So you need to make sure you're on top of things so that it's at least once a year.
I agree with that, and then looking at our inspection form, and even if you're doing the minimum of what the PSA training is, and then the maximum of what we do on our form, you're somewhere in between there. I think you're doing what you need to do.
I believe we addressed the last question in the chat, and I think we covered every other question that was submitted earlier through the content.
And we're pretty much at the top of the hour. So thank you so much, Ronnie, Donna, and Dawn, and Aaron and Zan for helping to pull this all together. I think it was a great learning experience today. I really enjoyed it. Appreciate your time, and thank you to everybody who joined us today. We hope you'll come back next Thursday at 1 o'clock for our session on water treatment. All right, everybody have a great afternoon.